All resources for this episode are posted in the show notes. You're listening to a special edition of Dare to Think, the official podcast of MereLiberty.com. What is going on in Cuba? The corporate media first reported that Cubans were protesting the U.S. trade embargo and lack of vaccines. Now they're reporting that it's a spontaneous protest against the Cuban dictatorship. But they are still neglecting to report that the new counter-revolution in Cuba has been sparked by young Afro-Cuban artists who were inspired by none other than the Black Lives Matter protests in the U.S. last year. Don't let the organization of BLM fool you. The problem in Cuba is not merely corrupt leaders mismanaging socialism or being tempted by state capitalism. Cuba has been hailed by American academics and politicians, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as the model for socialism in America. And Cubans who have realized the systemic oppression of their own people through socialism and communism are now in a fight for their lives. In today's episode, I'm speaking to an American with close connections not only to the Cuban people, but also to efforts to promote defection from the communist regime over the past 2 decades. So join me, Carrie Baldwin, with David Gay, as we stand with the Cuban people risking their lives as they dare to think about Cuban liberty.
Y eres tú mi canto de sirena, porque con tu voz se van mis penas. Y este sentimiento ya es tan viejo, tú me dueles tanto aunque estés lejos.
Aquí yo lo quiero decir en español y te lo voy a decir en inglés. Nosotros lo que queremos los cubanos es libertad. Mr. President, this is for you. What we want, us, the Cuban people, we don't want to lift the embargo. We don't want free luggages over there. We don't want medication and we don't want the vaccines. What we want is freedom.
Today I have with me David Gay. He's one of the admins of the infamous Liberty Memes page and also the Liberty Memes $5 Club, which I'll let him explain to you what that's about. And he's actually here with us today to talk about what's happening in Cuba, why what you're hearing from the mainstream media is not true, and what Cuban independence in the broader scope of history means for the rest of us. So welcome, David. I'm so glad to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. Why don't we just start out by you introducing yourself? Who are you? What's your connection to Cuba?
My connection to Cuba is actually my wife is a political refugee from Cuba. She came in 1998. Her father was a political prisoner in Cuba, and her mother was also neglectfully murdered by the Cuban regime because her father wasn't a party member. In fact, he was a political dissident, so they let her die of an easily treatable condition. And so that's part of my connection to Cuba. Also, in 1994, there was a raft crisis. Between 93 and 1994, there was a raft crisis of Cuban emigres trying to reach the United States. And many of them drowned, actually. Some of them made it to the United States, but most of them that were rescued at sea were brought to Guantanamo base for processing for refugee relocation. And those folks, they had a chaplain who went to seminary with my pastor here in Syracuse, New York at the time. And so when they were sent to Syracuse for refugee relocation, the chaplain at Guantanamo base said, "Why don't you call this pastor and he'll help you out when you get there?" And I was, I think, 13 years old, and I did not speak Spanish. I had limited knowledge of the language from a couple of levels of class and from a Venezuelan friend that I played baseball with. But the pastor said, you speak more Spanish than I do, so you're my translator. Wow. And so I went over to their house, these Cuban refugees, and we hit it off. And within a month, my brother and I were both basically Cubanized, speaking Cuban Spanish since I've been 13 years old. So I'm 40 now. So the majority of my life, I've actually spoken majority Spanish. And I do these interviews in English, and every once in a while I'll have a little grammatical blunder because my brain is probably not wired for English anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, my father-in-law, he was tortured in a Cuban. Actually, he just walked by the. I'm sitting in the car recording this, and he actually just walked by the window, give me a thumbs up because he knows what I'm talking about right now.
Good,
I
good.
told him I'm on my way to do another interview about what's happening in Cuba, and he was tortured in a camp, in a concentration camp called UMAP, and that means Unidades Militares para Ayuda a la Producción, and in English that means military units to aid production. And what it was basically, what they told the Cuban people, that it was a work camp for cadets who had to do their military service, their obligatory military service. But what it actually was a prison camp for non-desirables of the Communist Party. So Cuban Chinese were there, Christians were there, Jehovah's Witnesses, even the Catholic Church, most of their priests were sent there because they refused to renounce their faith in Christ. The homosexuals were sent there. And in my father-in-law's case, something so simple as having been an economics student and an accountant.
Wow.
Because it was absolutely necessary to get rid of anybody who could possibly think, especially in terms of economics, because Che Guevara's entire thing, Ernesto Guevara's entire thing, when he took over the Cuban economy, when they made him secretary of the Cuban economy, he said, we need to create a new man. And creating a new man meant you would not think of any of the things that you would think of in the past. And it's kind of like George Orwell in 1984 wrote that the party can tell you information and also tell you to forget that information, and then recall that information at convenience, and then forget that you had forgotten it when you reparrot it. So they can tell you, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, they said that they didn't have the funds for licensing fees to play Euro Cup soccer on the television in Cuba. And then 2 weeks later in Venezuela, they said, after the protests, they said, no, they're not protesting in Cuba. They're celebrating Euro Cup soccer results. Wow. So they can flick this on and off like a switch within weeks. I remember, for example, right now, the embargo is the hot issue. And I remember in the early 90s, it was another issue when people were coming here on rafts, and they'll do this. The left will do this even here to run cover for them. People are coming here on rafts to desperately escape, the repression and the inability to express themselves or to determine their own destinies. And they're not even allowed to leave their own country. And they'll say that it's because of the embargo. And then somehow, when the embargo wasn't too effective, when we were trading a lot more, remittances were flowing into the island, when tourism finally kicked off, they completely forgot about the embargo. I would talk to Cubans on the island maybe 10 years ago. I would send them messages over Facebook. We would hit it off, talk about baseball and different things. But if I talked about the embargo, they would tell me, we're not supposed to talk about that right now.
Wow.
So this is in Cuba, where they're also saying that the embargo is suffocating them. But I'll get to that in a second. So this prison camp, what happened, the way they were able to get everybody to go to this prison camp, first of all, if you know the history in Cuba, in the mid-60s, they nationalized the sugarcane industry, because among the industries that were exploitative of the workers was the sugar industry. And that was because it was owned by interests in the United States and things like Dixie Crystals and things like that. I'm not sure if it was Dixie Crystals. That might have been established by exiles here in the United States. I could be wrong about the history about the actual enterprise itself. Mm-hmm. But the Cuban propaganda was that the sugar industry was exploitative to the workers. And so when they nationalized, they couldn't get anywhere near, even 15% of the production numbers of the capitalist system that actually paid the workers to do it. So great idea. Let's just have slaves, because that's not exploitative.
Right.
So they took all the undesirables on the island and they sent them to this work camp, which is basically the size of the county that I live in. Wow. And you're just out in the middle of nowhere, and it's a sugarcane field, and you have a machete, and you live in a cinder block barracks. and you have a soldier, a captain of the military or something guarding over your barracks, and you have to wear a military uniform to look like a cadet. But you're
Wow.
not a soldier. So the way they were able to do this, and my father-in-law explains this to me, the way they were able to do this was first with gun confiscation. When the revolution took over, they said, well, a lot of Cubans have private guns. We need to register them to make sure that they're not being used in crimes. We need to take everybody's gun and put a registration number on each gun and send it back to you in the mail. And if you don't do this, you're probably working for the United States or the CIA or whatever, and you're probably trying to overthrow the government. So if you are found with a gun that doesn't have a serial number on it, you'll go to jail. You'll probably be executed. So everybody's like, well, I don't want to be executed. So they went to their town square with their gun, handed it over to the officials, filled out an information card with their address, with all their information, and said, here's my gun, put the etching on it and send it back to me. And they said, no worries, comrade, we'll send it to you. And as soon as they reached critical mass of gun confiscation, they went straight to the streets to kidnap people.
Wow.
So they would park at the movie theater, for example, at the cinema for the afternoon matinee. And they would just walk in, or they would park their buses and even tractor trailers in front of the movie theater. So when couples were coming out of the theater, they would just snatch all the men, because obviously they were doing these bourgeois activities of having time to go to the movies. So when they should have been working for a better communist society. So they would just grab them, teenagers, off the street and throw them on tractor trailers and ship them across the country to a place where they had no idea where they were, why they were there, what they had done to deserve to be there, when they would go home, no contact with their family, some of them for years. There are families still that have no clue what happened to their family members because they were taken to these work camps and executed at the work camps, and they just were counted as missing. So they would do that. And my father-in-law postulates that if one person was standing there with a gun, these goons wouldn't have been able to just show up and kidnap all the boys.
Yeah.
So in my father-in-law's case, they came looking for him, and his neighbor told him, his neighbor knew where he was and told the cops that he didn't know where he was. So they left a card and said, you have to come to this office on a certain date. And it was basically him getting drafted into this involuntary service. And he was able to at least wrap up some of his affairs before going to this office, even though he didn't know that he was going to be inducted into involuntary servitude. He was able to wrap up some affairs, unlike these teenagers who were just grabbed off the street and their lives just basically stopped at that moment. So he goes to the barracks where he's been cited, and when you get there and you sign in, they say, okay, go into that room over there. We'll be with you in a second. And the room was just full of people who were like, they're not letting us leave.
Wow.
And then they put them on a bus and sent them to the concentration camp. So this in particular is one of the historical examples of the Cuban government propagandizing and gaslighting their people, because they sent them out to the middle of the countryside. And some of these towns were populated with a few people. This is in rural Camagüey province of Cuba. And so they had to at least tell the people in that region why there were all these new people in their area. And so they would print newspaper articles and give television and radio reports of this camp being a military cadet camp. So when they got out of this camp, and we're talking all sorts of unimaginable human abuses, open latrines that they would be forced to swim in sometimes.
Wow.
There was always fresh blood on the wall outside of the barracks to warn them that any of their friends, if they attempted any sort of funny business, could be shot on the spot. And just all sorts of abuses. And people in order go home and see their families would stick their arm out to their neighbor and say, cut me deep enough to get me out of here so that I don't have to work anymore.
Wow.
With a machete.
Yeah. Wow.
And my father-in-law himself, I've asked him about this because it's, we're a very soft society here in the United States. And I've said, have you ever talked to a therapist about this?
Yeah.
You've obviously got PTSD. He says, listen, take a look at my hand. And he's got a big chunk missing from one of his fingers. And what I know about from having worked as a medical interpreter and in appointments that have to do with people who are missing digits is there's nerve damage. That if you touch that part of your finger that's been damaged, you will feel pain that goes all the way to your head.
Wow.
He says, this finger touches things that without me wanting it to every single day. And there's not a single day that when that happens, I don't remember absolutely everything that they did to me.
Wow.
But when he got home, his family had been propagandized to believe that he had been a military cadet. So when he said, no, I was in a torture camp, they didn't believe him.
Wow.
And even today, he's had some arguments with a couple of his family members, and I don't want to insult his family. They're very good people. But he has had arguments with a couple of them who lean a little more toward the Cuban government side and have told him, you were a cadet. What are you talking about? So propaganda, all it takes is just a little touch sometimes of propaganda that seems very innocent. The Cuban government's very good at this. They'll just lie about something very small like that, where it's not small to the person that's being lied about, but it seems like innocent news. And they won't cover it very much. They'll just say, oh, we've got this camp over there with our cadets and they cut the sugar cane. So then when you get out, there's no way to disprove that. And it's just like what they're doing today, where CNN is on the television saying Cubans are protesting for more COVID vaccines. When I know for a fact that just a few months ago, the Cuban government was one of the first to announce a COVID vaccine. And they announced that, don't worry, Cuba, we've got enough for everybody. And then we conveniently forget that information so that we can get to the point that we are today. And the American media is the one saying that that's what they're protesting.
Now, this is interesting because I already, as you're describing this, I already see a number of parallels with our own media. They'll report on things that seem fairly innocuous, but then they go and contradict themselves later. And for the most part, nobody notices it. But you're saying that they did this in Cuba intentionally in order to, keep most of the people in the dark and a gaslight. I think that's an excellent description. Am I seeing that parallel correctly?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just that they're doing that they do that in Cuba. It's not just that they did that historically in Cuba. The United States of America, our institutions, between politicians like AOC and Bernie Sanders, between professors at various universities that teach their children that Cuba is some sort of a success story of a socialist paradise, and the American media just spreading absolute falsehoods about what people are protesting in Cuba. So I'll tell you what people are actually protesting in Cuba right now.
Yeah.
Cubans have access to the internet. In general, they've got family in the United States and they've figured out how to get Wi-Fi over VPN, and they've figured out how to get access to information. And that information led to the point where last year, everybody was on lockdown all around the world, not just in the United States. And they're like, well, I guess I'll sit here looking at my phone. And information was being freely spread to these people about what was really happening, not just in Cuba, but in the rest of the world. And what did they see on their feeds the most? And this is an actual backfire, even of the communists themselves. What they saw the most on their news feeds in Cuba was Black Lives Matter protests. And even the Cuban government would say, look at the United States, like it's in shambles right now. There's these protests and the police are abusing black people, and it's just so horrible. And everybody's like, yeah, the police are abusing black people. Well, black people in Cuba and Afro-Cubans in the United States were very sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement because they know what it's like for an entire black population to be targeted by the entire government.
Yeah.
So they were inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. And they said, well, we saw what they did in the United States, and the United States has got to be more powerful than our small country. So let's do it here. And so hip hop artists stopped being afraid to say the truth, and they would include in their lyrics very sharp, very cutting lyrics against the regime. They would use slogans like, we're going to get out the machetes like the Mambises. And the Mambi movement is actually a throwback to the 1800s when they overthrew Spain with machetes. Spain had guns, and the Cubans had machetes. And they're one of the things that they keep saying in their lyrics and in their chants right now is that the Mambi movement has been reactivated. And these are obviously, if you want to take it that way and not say that art is art, these are treasonous lyrics to the Cuban government. And they would say things like, your evil revolution is over. And to just say revolución maligna, and it's not just evil, it's a malignant, it's intentionally this way. And so they would use these lyrics, and when I first heard the song, and there's a song called Patria y Vida, which means fatherland and life, or homeland and life, because in Cuba, the communist motto is Patria o Muerte, which means homeland or death. So if you're not with us, you deserve to die. And so they said, we don't want to say Patria o Muerte anymore. You know, I'm not with you, but I still love my country. So we're going to say homeland and life. And that was the name of the song that they came out with. There were 3 recording acts from abroad. They're all Cuban. There's Gente de Zona, which are superstar celebrities even on the island. They used to come and go as they please and give concerts in Cuba and then go home to Miami and live the life and give concerts here. They're superstars. And then there's Yotuel of a group called Orishas, which is based out of Paris, and December Bueno, who I believe spends time between living in New York and Miami. And he was actually at one of our protests the other day at the UN here in New York. And the other 2 are Michael Osorbo and Funky Style. And Michael Osorbo and Funky Style live in Havana. And they have seen the Cuban government come and take their own friends away for being part of a movement called the San Isidro movement, which is a movement of artists, poets, and singers to use their artistic expression to speak out about the abuses of the Cuban regime. That's how it started. That was the San Isidro movement, and then they made the song Patria y Vida, and when everybody heard that song with those cutting lyrics, they said, wow, these people risked their lives to be in this song.
Yeah.
They knew they could be killed or tortured or something, and they have been routinely harassed and beaten by Cuban police, those 2. And they don't care. Even in the lyrics, they say, well, it was 15 of us friends, which is the Movimiento San Isidro. In the lyrics, he says, 15 of us friends, we're out here, we're ready to die. Because there's nothing else you can take from the Cuban people. They've already taken everything else. The Cuban government uses the Cuban people as a farm for their own self-gain.
Somos artistas, somos sensibilidad. La historia verdadera, no la mal contada. Somos la dignidad de un pueblo entero pisoteada. A punta de pistola y de palabras que aún son nada.
No más mentiras. Mi pueblo pide libertad, no más doctrina. Ya no gritemos patria o muerte, sino patria y vida. Y empezar a construir lo que soñamos, lo que destruyeron con su mano.
Que no siga corriendo la sangre por querer pensar diferente. ¿Quién le dijo que Cuba es de ustedes? Si mi Cuba es de todos.
in a second. But so this movement was started by hip hop artists and by Afro-Cuban artists
Mhm.
that were inspired by Black Lives Matter. And now in the United States, Black Lives Matter is taking the side of the regime.
Wow.
So they're like, wait a second, we thought we were brothers and that you cared about what's happening to Black people in Cuba. I mean, the president of Cuba is white. Most of the people who run Cuba are white. Most of the police, the higher ups in the state security are white. They're beating the Black people to death in Cuba. They're kidnapping people's children. They're doing all sorts of terror against Black people. And Black Lives Matter is saying, well, your struggle really does not fit the narrative that we're
Yeah.
trying to push for a socialist system, which we think will be more conducive to social justice.
Wow.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And,
It only makes sense if you look at it from the lens of maybe these people are really trying to push Cuban communism on us.
yeah. The Black Lives Matter thing really frustrates me because it's never struck me as something that is anything other than politically motivated. And, I've tried to point out examples, but I think this example with Cuba and, Afro-Cubans in particular is striking because.
Well, Afro-Cubans in the United States consider themselves Black Americans.
Yeah.
Once they integrate into American society and they consider themselves Black Americans, and the struggle against racial profiling, against what we call black up, where if a Black guy gets pulled over for a speeding violation, there's automatically 2 cops behind him instead of 1.
Yeah.
I mean, these are things that we see even as libertarians, and it's totally fine in a liberty movement to say it's not okay to target Black people.
Mhm.
And I personally believe that Black lives do matter.
Yeah.
But this organization and the movement that they're trying to lead is not anything about racial justice.
Right.
In fact, they're promoting all sorts of racial injustices, including to Blacks.
So what's the connection? You mentioned the academics. What's the connection to academics? Does that have to do with critical race theory and what's being pushed with that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
This is actually a very long-standing thing in leftist circles, and we all know that most of our universities are leftist trash in this country. I mean, most people know that. And very specifically, most of the policies that they are pushing when they teach their students this propaganda comes from the Cuban model.
Mm.
So they say, okay, we need to do things like Cuba does them in order to have free healthcare, in order to have higher literacy rates, and in order to provide free education and things like that. Right. So it is not convenient to academia, who has been spending decades teaching children leftism based on the Cuban model, for the Cuban model to fall apart.
Right.
Or for what they're saying to have just been a total fabrication, which is what's coming out now. And that's why they're covering it up. They're saying, well, their protests have nothing to do with oppression. Their protests have nothing to do with racial justice for Black Cubans. Their protests are about COVID vaccines and food shortages caused by the embargo. So now I can get into why the embargo has nothing to do with it.
Yes. Yes.
The United States Office of Foreign Assets Controls, or OFAC, which is based out of the Treasury Department, gives priority designation to any sort of agricultural, food, or medicine that is to be sent to Cuba, which means they try to make sure that those things get to Cuba. The resources that Cubans need get there. And when I say they prioritize this, the United States does over $250 million a year in produce to Cuba. This is almost $2.5 million per Cuban citizen. There's 11 million on the island.
Wow.
So where is the food and medicine going?
Yeah.
It's going to the fat cats in the party that have not only do they drain every single resource they can get from the exterior, they also need every crumb they can get out of the Cuban people to continue to live large and abuse them.
Wow.
And this is the same in Venezuela. In Venezuela, guess where I've already given away the answer. The only Lamborghini store in Latin America is in Caracas. And Venezuelans can't afford a bottle of water. So why would there be a Lamborghini store in Caracas? Because somebody is buying them.
Right.
And this is the officials of the revolutionary governments. So to the embargo, I know you want to ask me something, so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and maybe you're going to get into this. So you mentioned, and I want to make sure I get the number right. You're saying that the United States sends $250 million worth of food and medicine to Cuba every year?
There's agricultural trade that goes on to Cuba, and it's from American farmers, and American even meat farmers send poultry. The majority of Cuban chicken and Cuban pork comes from the United States.
So here's my question, and you had mentioned this, I think, on the LCI roundtable discussion. Why aren't Cubans growing their own food in agriculture?
They're not allowed to, because when they do, the government takes it, and they take more than 80% of it.
So the Cuban
so for example, if a Cuban farmer owns a cow, he doesn't own a cow. The milk from that cow does not even belong to him. And it is a crime to actually, there was a time, and I don't know if it's still the current law in Cuba, where killing a cow without government permission was life in prison.
Wow.
And this is recently. I'm talking about within the last 15, 20 years.
Wow.
Because it's not property of the Cuban people, it's property of the Cuban government.
So not only is the Cuban government taking whatever America is sending down there, but they're also taking from the people as well.
Yes. So if you have a grove of avocado, mango, and orange trees, those don't belong to you either.
Wow.
And Cuba has an abundance of resources, but the Cuban people don't see any of it. And so we move along to Cuban party officials, and it's estimated that they have foreign investments in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, a Cuban who is not connected to that system, who is not in the party and a higher up with privilege, is not allowed to have a foreign investment, because it would be seen as some sort of a treasonous capitalist act. So these people travel abroad, they live abroad, they own mansions in Europe, they own mansions in Asia, in Africa, and even in the United States. There are communist officials from Venezuela that live in Doral, Florida, in Miami. They live a life of luxury and govern their country from the exterior. And their people are just a farm, and the soldiers do what they're told, even though their officials aren't even on the island.
Jeez. Okay, so I'm gonna ask sort of a devil's advocate question. Something that might come from a skeptic. The Socialist Party recently tweeted that Cuba doesn't actually have real socialism. This is a problem of state capitalism, and really the problem here is just you have corrupt leaders. It's not socialism itself that's the problem, or communism. It's just you have corrupt leaders. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I think the question on its face is absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's not your question. It's something that a communist would say.
Right.
And communists are notorious for coming up with absolutely absurd straw man questions that have no basis in reality. And so to say, for example, well, that wasn't real socialism, and this wasn't real socialism, and that other thing wasn't real socialism, where is real socialism then?
Right.
Where have they given this a shot where it hasn't turned into what they call state capitalism and corruption?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is that doesn't exist because of the inherent corruption of the people who are promoting these systems.
Right.
I mean, it requires theft in order to create such a society. You have to take from people. You have to dislodge the people who disagree with you. You have to get rid of them in order to be able to form the new man, as Che Guevara would call it.
Mm-hmm.
So you need murder and theft and torture and abuses and oppression in order for any of those systems to ever exist, because it's not human nature to give up every single one of their rights for the collective.
Right.
There, it always rises again where people find their voice as individuals and say, hey, wait a second, what about me?
Right.
So you can't have such a system without abusing.
Right. So, I want to go back really quick to something you had mentioned very early on about, I believe it was your father-in-law. He was educated in economics. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, he was a student of Austrian and Chicago School economics
Holy cow.
in Cuba, and this was during the Batista regime. And Batista had his own problems, but
Yeah.
he had plenty of his. I mean, as a libertarian, we know that it's not left versus right; it's the state versus you. And when you have a corrupt leader, you have a corrupt leader, whether it be Fidel or Batista or Machado, Menocal, or Diaz-Canel, or anybody else that Cuba's had.
So a lot of people who are not familiar with economic theory don't understand the role that economics plays in all of this. So do you want to touch on that a little bit? Why is economics and understanding it so important?
I'm not quite as wonkish on economics as most people. I'm a little bit more visceral in the types of things I say. But I will say that in order to establish their system, and first they needed to steal from everybody, and they needed to print like mad in order to be able to afford the things that they tried to pay for, to be able to afford to nationalize industry and try to do it themselves. They absolutely obliterated the Cuban dollar, the Cuban peso. And so anybody who was a student of economics would tell you, guess what? Printing money to pay for things is a really bad idea.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that even libertarians who pay attention to what the Federal Reserve does and to quantitative easing and to all these other things and adding zeros to the balance sheet in order to say, oh yeah, this is how much money, it always takes away from the amount of money that people are able to have or their purchasing power of what they've been able to save. So you absolutely need to silence anybody who would be critical of such an idea of let's just print a lot of money and have the value of our currency. I mean, that's what they do in Venezuela. Every time inflation gets out of hand, they double the inflation on the Venezuelan people so they can get the immediate benefit of the money that they're printing for themselves. So just like it happens in the United States, just like it happens around the world when governments want to pay for something by printing money or by just using money that they don't have, they get the immediate benefit of the previous value of that money. And then once it hits circulation for the people, it's worthless.
Yeah.
And that's what they were doing in Cuba. And that's why they had to lock up the economics students.
Right. Okay, so you just got back from a protest in New York, correct?
Yes, I helped coordinate a protest at the United Nations building. This does not mean that I believe the United Nations should do anything. This does not mean that I believe that the United Nations even cares, or even if they did care, they could do anything good about it. But there are people in those buildings that believe they take on face value the word of the Cuban Communist government instead of hearing it from the Cuban people. So we organized a rally of real Cuban people. And every time some of the diplomats or attaches or whatever they were from different countries would walk by us with their UN IDs, I would stand over there and say, hey, what country are you guys from? Do you know what's really happening in Cuba? Or have you heard it from the Cuban diplomats? Because I'd really like to tell you my side of the story from what I've seen. And yesterday I saw 4 Black men from the South African embassy. And South Africa's got its own racial issues right now, and that's a very difficult subject to get on.
Yeah.
But I said, do you guys realize that the uprising in Cuba right now was inspired by Black Lives Matter? And they were floored. And I said, do me a favor, take some of this. We had flyers with information about it. And I said, do me a favor, read over this. Get to know what's really being said by the Cuban people. here on the streets who have family on the island. Some of these people here on the streets right now have only been here for a couple of years or maybe even less. They're risking their lives. They're risking their families' well-being just to be at a protest in the United States, because the Cuban government and the Venezuelan government, they both send goons to take pictures of us and retransmit back in Cuba to know who's saying what. They monitor all of our social media posts so that if you have family on the island, they can suffer reprisals for what you're posting about or the fact that you're protesting. And they also keep a list to make sure that when you try to go back to Cuba, you get charged.
Wow.
So I give this information to people from other countries, to diplomats, and I don't know if they're actually, I know they have diplomatic credentials. So to say, hey, let's start a conversation, at least with your fellow African neighbors in the UN, and say, maybe something else is going on in Cuba. And maybe that'll make a difference. Maybe it won't. I have no clue.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there's any harm in trying that. So also, they did, and I didn't organize the entire rally. I don't want to take credit for the entire rally. I helped to promote it by traveling to various cities in New Jersey, doing flyering, all sorts of stuff like that. And we're in a chat where we all discuss best practices for how to do these rallies. So I'm one of the organizers, you could say. And these folks in an organization called Artists for Change did performance art yesterday, and it was so amazing. And I can send you the image of that so that you can show your people who listen to your podcast. They had blood on them, and there were folks dressed as Cuban military stabbing them with long sticks, stabbing them, and there was blood all over them, and they're stabbing them while they're lying down in the street next to a makeshift raft, which looks exactly like the rafts that you see made out of trash and household items that they use to escape the island, and the Cuban government chasing after them and murdering them for trying to escape. And they were lying down in the streets, and cars would drive by and say, "What is this? This doesn't look like a COVID vaccine protest."
Right.
These people are talking about human rights abuses in Cuba. So,
yeah. Say really, really quickly, what has been your experience with social media in this story? What is social media doing with it?
Okay, so in concert with the Cuban government, with the American left, with the useful idiots who are parroting what they say, with media saying that this is about COVID vaccines and about shortages caused by the embargo, all of that. If you say anything that's off the script from that, and you're just spending your time sharing information about what's really happening in Cuba, you'll get in trouble. I am currently on a 7-day ban that turned into a 30-day ban because I appealed it. So in my case, I may have incited a little bit of violence in Cuba. Unfortunately, it didn't get left up long enough to actually cause any difference. But and I say this as a Christian, I believe in legitimate causes of self-defense. And in the case that I'm about to describe, there were busloads, and I'm talking more than 10 buses, that were showing up loaded with police, and they were carrying rebar to go to the protests and lacerate the protesters and any other manner of ill that you can imagine you could do with rebar on a human being. And I just typed, "Queme la guagua esa," burn those buses. And I was immediately hit with a 7-day ban, and I appealed it and said, "No, you don't understand the context of what I'm trying to say." And they hit me with a 30-day.
Wow.
And all I was trying to do was say, you guys are defenseless against riot police with rebar that are about to commit human rights atrocities against you. Do something to save your lives.
Yeah. And this, bear in mind, the police and the people who are supporting the Cuban government are still all propagandized, right? They still don't believe that this is that true?
No, I don't think that there is anybody in Cuba, intellectually honest with themselves that actually believes that this is about vaccines or that this is about anything other than the abuses of the Cuban government, and that includes the people who are abusing.
Okay.
I believe that anybody that is claiming ignorance in that case or is acting like the protesters are just totally wrong or lying, I believe that every single one of those people has blood on their hands.
Because they know. You're saying
this is intentional, and that includes what they're doing here in the United States by gaslighting what the protests are really about, by getting Americans to turn a blind eye and trying to get the entire world to turn a blind eye to what Cuba is really about and what they're really doing to people. I believe that at this point they're complicit, and that's murder.
Yeah. You also mentioned on the LCI roundtable, or maybe it was Aaron who mentioned it, but the idea that the fall of Cuban communism is akin to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, I actually mentioned that, of the Iron Curtain.
Yes.
And this is because Cuba was a Soviet satellite, and in the Cuban Secret Service was actually trained by Stasi and the KGB in concert. So all of their tactics, we've seen them before. Those of us who grew up in the Cold War, we've seen all of their tactics before. Right. But Cuba has a way, and they've created basically their own Soviet Union. Cuba has created their own satellites of their communist country. And what they do is they go to countries that are underserviced by medicine, for example, and they say, okay, well, we're going to send our doctors and our medicine to your country, and in exchange, you'll give us your precious resources. And so what they do is, if you're a doctor in Cuba and you want to have a career, or you want self-determination where you're allowed to leave the country on your own with your whole family, is you have to complete one of these missions first. So you have to go to another country and you have to be a missionary for the Cuban communist system. And along with them are state security agents to make sure that they're not going off script. And they keep their families at home in Havana or Pinar del Rio or wherever in Cuba, so that if they try to escape while they're abroad, their family suffers for it. So not everybody willfully goes along with this. A lot of people are like, well, I got into medicine because I believe in helping people. And suddenly they've sent me on this mission that I'm not allowed to refuse.
Wow.
And it's human trafficking, because they get a benefit for sending human bodies to these countries. And what they're doing is they're plundering the resources of countries that are even poorer than Cuba. So exactly the same thing, where they've used Cuba as a farm for themselves, they use the rest of the world as a farm for themselves. Venezuela cannot afford to even process their own oil because it's just cost them too much, and is one of the most oil-rich nations on earth. And what happens to their oil? The Cuban government takes their oil in exchange for X amount of doctors or X amount of social workers. In Venezuela alone, as of 5 years ago, it was estimated that there are over 20,000, and this is verifiable information. You can Google or whatever you need to do. There are over 20,000 Cuban government agents, and I mean like security agents, not just people from Cuba, living in Venezuela alone. And in Venezuela, it is a law that every single office or profession requires at least one Cuban in the office or in the vicinity of all the rest of the workers, in order to basically be a spirit guide to keep you on the proper socialist path.
Wow.
I mean, this is not just happening in Venezuela. That's just Venezuela as an example. This is happening in Peru. It's happening in Ecuador. When I was in Italy, they do this with sports coaches. They do this with athletics, with academics. They do it and they're like, oh, we're teachers. We're here to teach the Venezuelan children how to read. And all they're doing is being spirit guides or propagandizing and bolstering the regimes of those countries. It's happening in Nicaragua right now. It's happening in Angola, in Mozambique, in other countries around the world. The Cubans have this satellite system of basically countries that are loyal to Cuba because they get some sort of a propaganda benefit out of it. I mean, the doctors that they're sending aren't even very well trained. They're not even that good.
Yeah.
But they get a propaganda benefit with their people of saying, okay, we've provided for you. We've provided teachers and doctors and such for you guys in Venezuelan society. And sure, they're Cuban, but they're here out of the goodness of their heart and all this other stuff. And meanwhile, they're sending their precious resources out the back door straight to Cuba. And the people of those countries don't get any other benefit except the bodies of Cubans in their country.
Wow.
And that creates a satellite system, a Cuban communist satellite system. And they do it here in the United States through academia. They do it by having teachers parrot this same narrative that Cuba has this beautiful healthcare system and this beautiful education system. And it's just total nonsense. It's a total fabrication.
Wow.
But it's dangerous because they use that as an opportunity to wedge themselves into society and preach communism and preach all this stuff about how what's really happening on my island is we're being abused by the United States.
Wow.
When the United States is sending them all the food.
Right.
And our embargo is not a blockade, it's an embargo. A blockade would be they're not allowed to trade with anybody. Cuba trades with the entire rest of the world.
Wow. People from America, so Cuban families who made it to America or Americans themselves, are not permitted to travel to Cuba to help these people or provide aid themselves. And this, as I understand, is the result of an executive order from President Clinton. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's Executive Order 6 something. I can't remember the exact number. This order was put in place because there was an organization called Hermanos al Rescate, which means Brothers to the Rescue. And they used to do flights over the Florida Straits to find raft people and pick them up and rescue them.
Mm-hmm.
And they would also do counter propaganda flights to put in messages to the Cuban government, and they would drop leaflets over Havana.
Mm-hmm.
And they got shot down. I mean, we're talking about a couple of prop planes that were shot down by Russian MiGs. And Russian MiGs, wow. I mean, that's a fighter jet.
Yeah, yeah.
And they got shot down and killed. And the response was, okay, nobody's allowed to embark out of the United States straight to Cuba anymore. And if you do, we'll seize your vessel. We'll send you to jail for a certain amount of years. And the amount of time that you've spent at sea trying to get to Cuba, you'll be fined up to $250,000 per day.
Wow.
So, and if you're found with anybody who's undocumented, who's from Cuba, and you embarked from the United States, and they're aboard your ship, you can be sent to 10 years in prison.
Jeez.
And that's for rescuing people.
It's for rescuing, yeah.
And so in Cuba, you're not allowed to leave without special permission. If you escape, your family suffers, or if you get sent back, you could go to jail. It doesn't necessarily happen. For example, if the Coast Guard picks somebody up and brings them back to Cuba, they do document that so that the UN Human Rights Commission keeps at least some sort of a tab on those people so that they don't just get tortured and disappear. Mm-hmm. So there are some sort of stop measures to the Cuban abuses, when there's exterior eyes on the individuals that could be abused, they don't usually touch those people.
Yeah.
Or the worst they'll do is they'll put them on house arrest and just harass them all the time, but they won't harm their bodies. They won't execute them because it just makes it too obvious what they're doing.
Obvious, yeah.
But basically, Cuba, in my opinion, belongs to Cubans, whether they be in Cuba or in the United States or Mexico or Italy or anywhere else in the world. Cuba belongs to Cubans. And if you're from Cuba, you should be allowed to go back to your country and solve the problems that are happening there, whether it be by airplane through an approved method or in your own vessel.
Right.
And so I think that it is duplicitous of the United States to condemn the fact that Cubans are not allowed to leave their island when preventing them from doing the exact same thing here.
And this is in the face of Biden, who I think it was yesterday or the day before, gave some fancy speech denouncing communism and what's happening in Cuba. But at the same time, he could revoke this executive order. And he also has
Mhm.
Department of Homeland Security is also saying that if you're in Cuba, you can't escape to America.
So it's worse than just Cubans aren't allowed to go and provide reinforcement, whether it be with arms or with food or medicine or whatever, or just to be there to bolster the protest numbers. As Cuban people who have family there, who would say, I'm standing next to my own blood relative in this protest, they're not allowed to go and do that. And then in Cuba, the Department of Homeland Security of the United States chief is Alejandro Mayorkas, and he was born in Havana. And his family fled the regime in the 60s and was granted political asylum in the United States. They had to flee Cuba, and he has put up a Coast Guard blockade of Cuban territorial waters to prevent people from coming from the United States, but also to intercept anybody that tries to escape Cuba. And what he said was, you'll be taken back to Cuba, but if you can establish a credible case of political asylum, we'll resettle you, but not in the United States. And he was very vague about this. He said, we'll resettle you in a third country. So picture yourself in Cuba right now. If you are a protester and you know that they're coming for you, and maybe in some cases they're just giving people fines for public disorder, but in other cases they're charging people with actual treason and they want to execute them. And say you're one of those people who is subject to being executed for inciting insurrection. You don't even know where the United States will send you if you can establish a credible case of asylum.
Right.
Or a credible case of political persecution. I mean, they could drop you off in Venezuela.
Right.
I mean, you have I don't think that that's likely, but you don't have an idea. There's no security right now. There's no way for the Cuban people to know that they're safe.
Yeah. And if they get dropped off in a third country that, Cuba has people in, then
that's the other thing. Cuba has people absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
I'll give an example. When I was working, and I didn't introduce myself as somebody who worked in professional baseball, but I did work in professional baseball for the better part of the decade of the early 2000s. And I went around the world inciting Cuban defections, telling Cuban baseball players how they could become professional ball players, what they needed to do to establish an asylum case, what countries they would need to go to live in, what kind of offers they could get from major league teams, how that whole process worked, and what they needed to do to escape right now at the tournament where they were playing at the time. And what I noticed was that the Cuban delegations always had a lot of extra people. So for a baseball tournament, you would assume that you're getting a visa to a country for your team and for the coach. And Cuba, so maybe the United States would have a 25 ball players on a roster plus 5 coaches. So 30 people get a visa to come to this country and play baseball. And Cuba would send 60.
Wow.
And 30 of those people would be state security. Half of the baseball players themselves would be military and state security, and the coaches were state security.
Wow.
So they're getting visas to other countries on false pretenses. And this isn't even just the Cuban mission works. This is them. Anytime they go anywhere, they require visas for absolutely everybody in state security. And they say that there's something else. So they'll go and they'll say, well, this one guy is the statistician. This other guy is the historian. This other guy is a reporter. And they're all just state security. It's funny because I was in Mexico, but about them being state securities, they are everywhere. The Cuban government has state security everywhere. They even have them in the United States. We've seen them at our rallies. I mean, people like us, and I can't, I don't want to speak untruths or conspiracy theories, but those of us who have either lived in Cuba or worked internationally with Cuban people have made, an instinct out of recognizing Cuban agents. Right. We know exactly who they are as soon as we see them. For example, at a recent rally, there was one guy who was standing there who would not react to anything that was said. And that's including very emotional things and things that would be hard hitting to any Cuban, whether they're with the regime or not. they would at least react and be like, well, I disagree or something like that. So I started handing out flyers, and everybody was like, who didn't get one would say, could I have one of those? But he was the only one who wouldn't move.
Mm.
He was expressionless. He was just staring at us like he was trying to hide some sort of anger.
Mm.
And that was it. It was his job just to be there and be emotionless. And we recognized him in a heartbeat. So when I was in Mexico, but that's a danger to the Cuban people abroad, is that there's Cubans who are doing this, who are keeping tabs on them, who will hit them over the head with a baseball bat in another country just for fun. And we are subject to abuse if we're in other countries and Cuban agents recognize us. When I was in Panama, the Cuban agents did attack us at the baseball stadium during an Olympic sanctioned event in full public view of the Panamanian military.
Wow.
So yeah, they're not afraid to do these things. So Cubans do have a legitimate case to be afraid when they're not under the protection of, for example, a country like the United States that they assume is a free country. So when I was in Mexico, I went to this bar to have drinks, and it was a Cuban bar in Mexico. And apparently, or according to the legend at the bar, it was where Fidel and Che became friends and would, over drinks, discuss how to have their revolution in Cuba. Or it was where they planned the second attack, or when they launched it was something along those lines of like the foundation of Cuban revolutionaries, or of where they planned their attacks was at this bar.
Yeah.
So naturally, this bar was loaded with Cuban state security. Now, this was at a baseball tournament, a youth baseball tournament. And the whole purpose of sending security to this event was to stop people like me. So I was obviously their target of even being in the country, and they were too drunk to recognize me.
Wow.
So I walk in and I just hung out with them for a little while, and I start drinking, and I sit down next to this one guy, and he's like, oh yeah, you live in the United States? Well, I'm Cuban state security. And he pulled out his Cuban state security ID and showed it to me. And it says Seguridad de Estado G2, which means G2 state security. Wow. And I was like, well, isn't that funny? Because I kind of figured as much. I recognize you guys, but you don't recognize me. I'm literally the guy that you're supposed to be here trying to stop. I said this to his face, and he says, well, then we're enemies and I can't talk to you. I was like, nah, it's just ridiculous. Just keep drinking. So we had a shot together. And he kind of calmed down. And I'm thinking, man, these people, they suddenly shut off when they think that you're the imperialist enemy, and that next thing you might say might be to reprogram them or brainwash them against communism. I mean, I had this one guy, I would talk to him about pro baseball. You could tell who the commie baseball players were and who the ones that were interested were, because if you said, hey, did you catch the Yankees game last night? They broadcast it in our hotels at a tournament, right? They said, did you catch the Yankees game? And they would say, Cuba solo, Cuba solo, Cuba solo, which means only Cuba, only Cuba, only Cuba. And they would walk away. And it was a trained response. Wow. And if you asked other people, they were like, yeah, I did catch the Yankees game last night, and Orlando Hernandez was fire. And Orlando Hernandez is a very famous Cuban defector who's a friend of mine. And they would say stuff like that. They were like, yeah, oh yeah. So one time I showed up in front of the entire Cuban delegation at a tournament wearing an Orlando Hernandez jersey. And the security team flipped their lid. They started calling my room in the middle of the night, telling me they would castrate me, all sorts of ridiculous. I was like, what'd I do, bro? And they're they're like, you know what you did. You're here to be a provocateur for the imperialists. So when we're at this bar, end of the night, these guys are in this country as either diplomats. The one who's identified himself as state security said that he works at the embassy in Mexico City. So you would assume, Mexico City is a pretty advanced place. It's kind of like New York, a little bit more third world in what we know. Yeah. But everybody's got modern cars in Mexico City. They've got Fords and Chevys and everything like that.
Right.
And so he's waiting for me outside, and he says, can you help me push start my car? And I'm like, the Cuban government couldn't spring at least for a car that'll start for you? My man, you got to get out. And I pushed his car for her. I started, and he said, "Thank you very much. Have a good night, and it was a pleasure to meet you." But
Wow.
you never know when that'll plant the seed in this person of some sort of discontent. Where
Yeah.
like the guy who is like, I, I mean, I was nobody,
Yeah.
but I was able to speak to these people and tell them, there is a better way.
Yeah. That's an amazing story. I love that story. Okay, so I want to wrap up, but I want to ask for the average American Joe Schmuckatelli not paying attention to much else, but here's this. Why should they care about what's happening in Cuba right now?
Well, as I expressed before, American academia, there are politicians, there's social media that is silencing us for talking about the abuses in Cuba. There has to be a reason.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a reason why. I mean, cui bono, there has to be a reason why the media feels the need to cover up the truth about what's happening in Cuba or gaslight us and say that why they're protesting is something totally different from the direct words that we've heard from the protesters, the direct words that we heard from the song that inspired the protests, the direct word from the family members that are watching real-time videos here in the United States of their family members in Cuba being abused. There has to be a reason why they're telling a completely opposite story of what we're out here protesting.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a reason why. And for me, in my opinion, it is a progressive push toward a Soviet-esque or a Cuban-style socialist system here in the United States.
Yeah.
The fight for me, in my opinion, the fight against Cuban communism, the way it has infested societies around the world, including our own at this point, is an American fight to liberate us from the progression towards socialist and communist systems.
Right.
So I think it's very important when everybody's like, oh, well, I'm a libertarian because I want to get more libertarians elected and have more liberty-minded legislation in the United States. And like, do you realize who it is that's pushing against those things?
Right.
A lot of it is paid for by the Cuban government in one way or another. So Cuba is considered by most Latin American anti-communist activists as the number one exporter of hemispherical communism.
Wow.
And they say that when Cuba's system fails and the Cubans can no longer afford to have all these agents in their countries, then that will mean that their countries will finally be free as well.
Wow.
And that includes us.
Yeah.
Because the examples that they use here in the United States, the left and the left's useful idiots, the examples that they use to give glowing reviews to the systems that they're trying to implement here, their examples are Cuban examples.
Mm-hmm.
So when Cuban examples fail, they have no example that they can turn to.
Right.
I wanted to say,
yeah,
there is value in getting off the internet and talking to human beings in real life. I spent several days in many cities of New Jersey and New York trying to recruit Venezuelans and other people who would be anti-communist. And something came to mind. Probably the biggest fight against communism in the world right now is against China.
Mm.
And I realized I've seen Falun Gong protesters in Chinatown, Queens, handing out petitions that say, end the evil Chinese Communist Party. Maybe I should find some of them and tell them about this rally in front of the UN.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I was walking down the street after having a delicious lunch in Chinatown, Queens, and someone hands a petition to me. Just I'm walking down the street and they just shove it in my face and it says, end the evil Chinese Communist Party. And I looked at them and I said, I've been looking for you. And there's just two old, unassuming ladies who were just doing their diligence of getting it. And Falun Gong is a religious sect in China that is particularly marginalized and abused and even genocided by the by the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "You guys are Falun Gong, aren't you?" And she said, "Yes." But she didn't speak much English at all. So I got out Google Translate and I said, tomorrow we're having a big anti-communist rally in support of Cuban liberty. And I know you guys are anti-communist. And so please send some people. And I showed her that in simplified Chinese on Google Translate. And she said, here's my phone number. Could you please send me all of these details?
Wow.
And then I sent her a reminder in Chinese that said, remember, tomorrow's where we're going to be at the UN at 12 o'clock. And sure enough, they sent their independent press.
Wow.
And their version of independent press is very widely distributed. I would imagine that millions of people see this.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Chinese community now, anybody who reads independent press in China or abroad, who keeps up on the anti-communist movements, is reading full descriptions of the protests, of why these people are protesting, the things that happened to their families, because they interviewed almost every single protester at the rally yesterday, name by name, case by case, and included their full stories in the article. And it's all in Chinese.
That's awesome. That is so great. All right. It has been such a pleasure talking with you, David. I want to ask, what can listeners do to help promote Cuban liberty?
A lot of people are asking, obviously I gear a lot of what I do toward voluntarism and helping people out voluntarily. We didn't really get into what Liberty Means $5 Charity Club is. It's a group that I have online where I promote voluntarism, where basically we should be helping people if we claim that the government shouldn't be helping people.
Right.
If we believe that the private market will intervene and that charity will intervene if the welfare system doesn't exist, then we need to prove that. We need to prove that that will actually happen. And I think it's better to have real examples of it working right now. Yeah. So with that said, most of my crowd is voluntarist, so they want to throw money at things a lot. Mm-hmm. And I would say the Cuban people are not asking for money. The Cuban people are asking for awareness about their cause.
Yeah.
The only thing that they really need right now is internet. They need to be able to continue to communicate with each other. And so if there's causes that are helping families reconnect with each other, helping get phones down there and helping get phone lines reattached and or reconnected, and helping people get internet or VPN and things like that, those would be good causes if you see some of those to go to. But in general, we are having rallies every single day around the country. We are out in the streets protesting communism. And this is a communism that has infected American society and is causing most of these ills and most of the pushback on libertarian philosophy and activism in the United States. Yeah. So talk about it. Tell people about it. Repost things that you see about it. The best thing that we can do right now is make the American public aware that what they're being told by the media has absolutely nothing to do with real Cuba. And what they're being told by the media is running cover for an abusive communist regime so that they can buy themselves time to implement the same thing here. Yeah. This is a uniquely American fight. We have our own fight as Americans. And I say this because I know there's a lot of libertarians who just don't care about what happens in the rest of the world. Or they do care as long as it's so that they can protest the fact that the United States shouldn't have militarism in the world. I am not calling for U.S. intervention. I am not calling for UN intervention. I'm calling for awareness to the point where maybe we could actually get that executive order repealed and Cubans will be allowed to resupply their own people.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I'm going to post as many links in the show notes as I possibly can, including to the Liberty Memes $5 Club, and whatever else I can. If you want to pass me some links, I can do that as well.
There's Liberty Memes Returns is the current one. I've been posting a lot of stuff on Cuba through surrogate mods because I'm banned for saying that people should defend themselves against the abusive Cuban police. If people want to see some of the atrocities of the Cuban government in real time and some videos of the things that are happening in Cuba right now, be it protests or speeches or anything like that, there are a few resources online. One of them is ADN Cuba. You can find ADN Cuba on Facebook, and they post videos all the time. There's also Cyber Cuba Noticias, which is Cyber Cuba News, or you can just look it up as Cyber Cuba, but it's spelled with an I, so cyber with an I instead of a Y.
Okay.
Those two are excellent resources for finding videos about what's happening in Cuba.
Okay.
And I must say, one last thing, I saw something really cool this afternoon as I was driving home, looking at my phone while driving, which is, because I'm free to do whatever the heck I want.
Right.
And there was a video of some of the Florida Cubans that made the trip to just off the coast of Cuba. They made it to 15 miles out in almost to Cuban territorial waters.
Wow.
And they lit off the best professional fireworks show from the water I've ever seen. And the people in Cuba saw it.
Oh, that's amazing.
And the people, I'm like crying about this right now. I'm kind of emotional. The people in Cuba saw it last night at 9 p.m. They were filming from Havana and they sent us the videos.
Oh.
And this is to our group chat our WhatsApp chat where we've got some of us that are organizing protests and some of them are protesting in Cuba and sending us the videos. And you could see this beautiful fireworks show right outside of Havana on the water. And they knew that was their Cuban brothers there to support them.
Oh man. Oh, that's amazing. That's very emotional.
Yeah.
Very emotional.
I'll send you the video and you'll say, wow.
Yes. Yeah. I want to see it and I want to link it. Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much, David, for coming on at such short notice and letting me interview you. This has been wonderful. I can't wait to get this out and share it with my audience, and hopefully it gets spread around to others as well.
I have one last thing I would like to say.
Okay.
If any of you have a network or friends or any of your listeners know of other podcasters that are liberty-minded or even conservative or want to get the truth out about Cuba, please tell them.
Yes.
Get in touch with David Gay of Liberty Memes and have him talk about this, because I cannot stop spreading the news about this and I really need it to get out for my own selfish reasons of my own immediate Cuban family and for the Cuban people in general.
Yes.
And for us here in the United States, our liberty is threatened by not speaking up about this.
Yes. Amen. Absolutely. Yes. All right. I will definitely, I know some people who could interview you. So I will reach out to them, and anybody else listening to this, definitely, get in touch with David or myself and I can connect you with him.
I mean, I know there's some Liberty events coming up this summer. Tell them, have me come speak about this. This is not a dying issue. I this afternoon I was talking to a fellow activist in the movement, and I said, there are some people who have already moved away from it like it's over.
Yeah.
And that's like cashing out a Bitcoin when it was $1.75.
Right. Yes.
This is going to get bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think so. All right. Very good. Well, it was lovely to speak to you. And if you want to chat again, if there's more that you want to talk about, you can reach out to me and we can do another episode.
Thank you. Viva Cuba Libre.
Yes, Viva Cuba Libre.
Ya se acabó. 60 años, 30 dominó.